Indictments galore. Former President Trump is now the subject of multiple indictments for violation of criminal statutes. Do these indictments raise important and maybe troubling questions about the nature and use of criminal law and its place in our public life? Let's find out in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try and bring you an independent take on the issues of the day, keeping a careful eye on the fate of liberty as best we can. And as always, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Williamson Evers, who is the director of the Independent Institute's Center on Educational Excellence, but also a noted polymath. Hello to you, Dr. Williamson Evers.
Hello, Graham.
It's great to see you. But also, again, as our friends who keep up with us are familiar with our noted legal expert, William Watkins, Jr., who is now well known to our friends. Thanks so much for joining us, Bill Watkins. We're grateful.
Good to be with you, man, again today.
So we're going to plunge into what seems to be the very latest, how to make sense of these multiple indictments against former President Trump. We're not so much interested in nailing down every detail, although the more facts we have, the better, but in understanding the significance of this series of indictments in the larger legal and constitutional setting as best we can. So let's start with this. But at the moment is the most...
Before we start, I think we should expand a tiny bit on what you said right at the outset, and that is...
Sure.
For people who are presidents and other high officers, we have an impeachment process that's supposed to address things that they do that are run counter to their duties and what they should be doing in office. Whereas crimes are supposed to be things that are clear, bright line things that the average person can understand and not do, avoid, and then if they do them, they should be punished and they have extra rights. Whereas in impeachment, it's a broader thing. It's often vaguely stated in terms of things like high crimes and misdemeanors, and political and legal judgments are combined. So it looks, in a sense, as if the powers that be within the American system have failed to impeach Trump and convict him. They impeached him, but they didn't convict him when he was president. And now they're looking throughout the laws, the statute books, and they're combing them and broadly interpreting or misinterpreting laws, broadly construing them to get Trump, as Alan Dershowitz, the former professor of law at Harvard, has put it.
So this is kind of like the very broad picture here, isn't it?
Yeah.
The question is, what are the remedies for wrongdoing? And constitutional remedy for presidents is impeachment, but if you break a statute, a criminal statute, then you're going to, not just lose your presidency, but more significantly, lose your rights as a citizen.
If you're a president and you murder somebody, of course, the criminal statute should, but you shouldn't take things that are within the scope of your office or broadly understood, historically understood, and then go after those using the criminal law. And I think that's an important angle for us to take as we dig through this.
That's right. I'm going to let Bill Watkins weigh in on this big picture. And the big picture, to put it in my simple terms, is, a lot of people I know say, well, they couldn't get him through the impeachment process. They got to get him through the criminal law. What do you think about that big picture, Bill Watkins?
It's hard to argue with that view of things at this point. He had articles of impeachment brought twice. Most of his administration, allegations of Russian collusion and this, that, and the other throughout the tenure in office. And now this is an attempt, a lot of people believe, and it's hard to disagree with them when you look at some of the facts, to jail the man and be rid of him in the system for good. the question is criminal law, is that a function of a special counsel or anyone else, or is this essentially a political question that you put the facts out there, we have a First Amendment, and you let the people at the ballot box make a decision. If they think the guy's a bum and a crook, they don't vote for him, or they vote him out of office. Who is to decide? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Who is to decide?
Yeah, so we have at least 3 remedies for wrongdoing by high public officer. I mean, there's the election, or denial of election or re-election, and then there's impeachment and removal, and then there's the criminal law. Which one fits the facts is kind of like the big underlying question here. Should we go to the facts then on the latest indictment?
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should start exploring.
Okay, so apparently the special counsel. Go ahead, Bill Watkins.
I mean, this is what I would call essentially the January 6th indictment. The left wants January 6th to be like December 7th and the American political lexicon. Therefore, they have crafted charges, again, accusing President Trump of conspiring with a number of unnamed individuals, though we can talk about this a little later. It's pretty easy to figure out. It's Rudy, several others, to obstruct the proceeding of Congress and to interfere with the citizens' right to vote, as well as there's overall conspiracy, what we call in the business, it's a 371 conspiracy. 18 U.S.C. Section 371 carries 5 years, $250,000 fine, 3 years supervised release, that he conspired with his legal team and others and the whole January 6th electors, different slates, allegations of fraud to try to corruptly retain the presidency there. So that's essentially the crux of this. And, Evers has made some good points earlier when we discussed this offline that, for example, I believe it's 18 U.S.C. Section 241 is a Reconstruction era statute that Trump's charged with, which essentially alleges that he interfered with someone's right to vote, which was designed more or less in states with black codes that tried to prevent black folks from voting after.
It was against the Ku Klux Klan and other Night Riders in the South who used terror and violence to block black voters and also Republican voters during Reconstruction. These
of course,
these
black
things
voters and Republican voters was overlapping categories at that time.
Yes, but also white Republican voters.
Yes.
So, if you look at these different things, we have the contingent electors, or as the newspapers often call them, the fake electors. This has been used before. It was used during the Kennedy-Nixon election for Hawaii when people weren't sure what was going on, and they wanted to have electors in reserve in case there was a discovery about voter fraud or miscounting or something like that. So Trump had legal advice. His campaign had legal advice that this had been done before and they should do it again. It's within this. I sound like I'm an advocate for President Trump in all respects or something like that. I think that's a misconstrual, but I'm trying to have the constitutional system work right and not to personally defend Donald Trump or advocate his reelection or anything like that. It seems to me that if you are the President of the United States and you have this power vested in you to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, and you heard and read and heard from your counselors and advisors that laws in the different states were changed in ways that made fraud more susceptible than before. You've heard some claims about fraud. It's within the scope of your office, in my view, to call around and see what's going on. If you look at the letter, the telephone call to the Georgia man that was in charge of election counting, yes, Trump says some numbers and various things that they don't sound very good, but his lawyers are saying towards the end of that same conversation to pursue this carefully and legally and not to somehow do something wrong. When they describe Trump's speech where he talks about the people going from the Oval up to the Capitol, the indictment leaves out the part where he says, go peacefully and patriotically. I mean, this is very tendentious. And
yeah, it's tricky because former President Trump was always pretty wily in his statements. I mean, as you mentioned on January 6th, he said, you got to go fight. But then he says, go peacefully. So which is it,
Well, in
maybe you fight peacefully.
Politics, people use rhetoric that when you say we're targeting this opponent, it doesn't necessarily mean you're
right.
Targeting him with a rifle or a bow and arrow or something. So they quote these various people that told Trump, well, you've lost. But the indictment doesn't quote people that told him you won. And they're keeping it from you. So he was undoubtedly, as we know, surrounded by such people.
Turning to Watkins, though, you mentioned, I'm glad you know some of these details, Section 371 of that act, of that statute. Apparently, under that, you could be found guilty potentially of conspiracy to defraud and corruptly obstructing the voting. But does corruptly obstructing, Bill Watkins, does it necessitate that you knew that what you were doing and the things you were saying were false? What if you thought the things you were saying were true? Would that be corruptly?
Well, he's got several defenses along those lines that, we'll see eventually raised. One, advice of counsel.
Yes.
If whatever we might think of, say, Sidney Powell's abilities, John Eastman, who is one of the unnamed co-conspirators along with Powell, is certainly, as a legal mind, though we might disagree with some of his conclusions on the powers of Pence and counting votes. He was a Supreme Court clerk, a law professor, a
dean of a law school. Yeah,
a dean of a law school, a credentialed person. Rudy Giuliani, until his association with Trump, was pretty much as close to a national hero. He was cleaned up New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, he cleaned up New York. He led the city after 9/11, presidential candidate himself. He was a DA that prosecuted mobsters. So you have advice of counsel. Two, you'll see the take care argument that Evers raised that he was simply following constitutional commands of his office there. There's a number of affirmative defenses that can be raised in these issues. And you're right, we've only heard one side of the. And does he say a lot of stupid things? Does he make a lot of mistakes? Yes, he does. And that's why it's easy to have a 45-page indictment with various quotes and things. But there is a second half of the story that will need to be heard.
So focusing back on that one piece, he'd have to have corrupt intent. And if he actually believed some of these legal advisors, then maybe his intent wasn't corrupt. Maybe he was just mistaken. And maybe he could be forgiven for believing that these highly credentialed legal experts were correct in their interpretation. I mean, maybe they weren't, but if he believed that they were, does that eliminate corrupt intent?
It absolutely would allow a jury in a lot of cases, for example, like a tax protester. Even though we think some of these guys are nuts, and many of them are.
Yes.
However, I've seen physicians, educated, intelligent people fall for some of these tax protester arguments. And a lot of those cases, when they go to trial, comes down to the intent. And what if they had a good faith belief in some of these arguments, and they didn't think they were violating the law? I think you'll have a similar issue in this case.
So I wonder if we should turn to the Mar-a-Lago. So that we just did the January 6th. I wonder if we should turn to the Mar-a-Lago. So we've got the Espionage Act. We've got the charge that Trump asked subordinates to erase tapes and move things around.
Right.
We've got the larger question of what should be kept secret. What this is like, not just what the current rules are, but what in principle we as classical liberals think should be kept secret. And I guess finally we have the parallel cases of Joe Biden, Vice President Pence, Hillary Clinton. Just a lot of people that have documents lying around their premises.
So this has to do with a couple things. It has to do with, well, basically what happened in Mar-a-Lago. That is to say, stuff was kept that was classified apparently, and then he attempted...
But they're not charging him under the Presidential Records Act. They're charging him under...
Instead, they're charging him under...
the Espionage Act, and it doesn't matter if the document is classified or not. The Espionage Act goes back to World War I, before the classification system kicked in. So when Wilson was president, there was no classification system. So they're saying it's just documents that pertain to national security, which is a very vague thing. But
apparently the argument, though,
there also has to be intent, and it's not clear that Trump knew that there were some sort of documents of the ones that they're alleging are the ones he shouldn't have had were in there because he hadn't gone through them. So anyway,
the issue is he had some documents that they thought he shouldn't have, and then he told his assistant to kill or destroy the tape, which would have shown destruction of such documents, but the tape wasn't destroyed and the documents weren't destroyed. But he tried to, and that's the charge. Have I got that right?
He's not charged with having tried to destroy the documents. He's only charged with hiding them.
Hiding them.
Not returning.
Yeah, but the superseding indictment, I think what you're talking about, Graham, deals with an attempt to destroy video footage, which would have been evidence of the safekeeping of the documents or not. And he did. Were they destroyed the documents themselves? No. Do we have footage? Yeah, but it's just like a conspiracy. If you're charged with conspiracy, it is an agreement or tacit understanding. It doesn't have to come to fruition. The crime is the agreement.
Right.
Similarly, in this case, it would be an attempt. So the charge is attempt. It doesn't have to come to fruition there, but there has to be an effort made to overt act, essentially, in furtherance of it. So that's what we're dealing with the superseding indictment, dealing with possible destruction.
So that's very
helpful.
Evidence. Very helpful detail clarification there.
So, Bill, so it looks that the superseding indictment has things that are very problematic for President Trump. On the other hand, what about the vagueness problem with the Espionage Act?
Now, one, I will say, first of all, Trump shot himself in the foot with these documents. Now, can I agree maybe with Evers and arguments that do you really need to resort to the Espionage Act, which carries significant statutory penalties and was intent likely on individuals, say, trying to take military plans to the Kaiser back in World War One. Was Trump going to give this stuff to the Russians? No one's alleged that. But he shot himself in the foot because he didn't want to. It's his personality. He didn't want to play ball. He didn't want to turn his documents over. He thought it was cool to keep some of these things. He blabs about it. There is a tape recording. I probably shouldn't be showing you this. This is secret, and I could have declassified it when I was president, but I didn't. Do I think from that first indictment, can the special counsel prove the elements of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt? It looks like he's got a good shot. I think Trump's in trouble. I think when I looked at the sentencing guidelines on these things, as I recall, the guidelines are up there around the 120-month or 10-year range if a judge sentenced him pursuant to the guidelines. But the question in this case is this a matter where that statute should have been wielded, or whether there should be a criminal prosecution at all, or would, say, a congressional investigation to publicize, or special counsel's report to publicize the malfeasance and stupidity exercised by Trump with classified documents.
And let's say we think this should better be seen under the Presidential Records Act rather than the Espionage Act. Well, there are no penalties. They prescribe procedures, but there's no penalties. It's more of like a set of regulatory guidelines for people leaving office, and it just seems that what Bill Watkins is saying, publicity, political, voting people out or not electing people is maybe the way to be handling this,
or impeaching and removing them if
they're still in office at that time. So I know there's ideas of impeaching people after they leave office, which we've seen, but the point is, again, they're really throwing the heavy stuff at Trump, and that does not in any way say that Bill Watkins is not right, that the President Trump shot himself in the foot, acted recklessly here.
Yeah, well, the really hard-edged piece of that bit, which seems like the strongest criminal law claim against him, is the attempt, an agreement with someone else, namely his assistant, to try to eliminate evidence that was sought. So it was obstruction of that inquiry. And apparently he did that, but the trouble was, and you could be found guilty of that crime even if you didn't successfully carry it out, apparently, because what you're saying, Bill Watkins, has to do with the decision, the effort to obstruct.
That's right.
Yeah, so he could be caught on that one, but the question is, he was just one guy, and it was his employee apparently, and the guy didn't do it, and Trump didn't make him do it. Is that enough to convulse the republic through this criminal prosecution?
It should be enough to at least make us shake our heads. I don't think it's worth convulsing the republic, because obviously, what they're trying to do is put pressure on his personal assistant to roll. And I don't think, again, based on what I've seen just in the charging document, it's a speaking indictment. A lot of indictments are just a paragraph. But this is a speaking multi-page indictment, and it's pretty damning if those allegations are true. And I don't think we dispute a lot of them. But they're trying to get him to roll to hurt Trump. And again, that's what, going back to the most recent, what I'll call the January 6th indictment, the 371 conspiracy and others, if you notice, it's a conspiracy, but only one person is charged.
Yes, I thought that was interesting.
And
it's sort of against the definition of conspiracy.
That's not atypical, but likely what the purpose of doing that is is to try to get Rudy, Sidney Powell, John Eastman, some of these other people to be scared out of their minds that they're going to go to federal prison for an extended period of time and roll on Trump that, oh yeah, Trump told me, yeah, this is ridiculous, but we'll try this, just so I can hang on, to hopefully get them to roll, give a statement on him that can be used at trial and try to get a better deal for themselves under the statute. Probably plead to maybe an information, which is, a special counsel could issue without a grand jury to maybe some lesser charge, or if they just pled, say, to the conspiracy, which is a 5-year statute, he could make what we call 5K 1.1, which is a provision of the guidelines, which is a motion for a downward departure, asking the judge to sentence them lower than the guidelines call for. So cut their time, a time cut. So that's obviously the game plan, is to try to get some of those people.
Right.
Again, a lot of people advanced in life who, Rudy, for example, is not a young man.
Right.
That would not like to die in federal prison to give information and get on board there. So we see that also with this manservant of Trump's that is in the first, the records indictment, and then the obstruction issues there. So, it's a lot of tactics there by the special counsel's office to try to get people to play ball so he can, bury the defendant.
So I think it should kind of wind up the Mar-a-Lago thing somewhat along these lines. So we protect a lot of secrets in the United States government. There's this vague thing of something that's important to national security that's in the Espionage Act. And then there's the classification system. We know from a commission that Daniel Patrick Moynihan sat on some decades ago that we wildly overclassify documents. We know from social science that the tendency of a bureaucrat is to avoid making waves, avoid making trouble for himself or his office, or her office, and therefore to overclassify, because if you underclassify, you can only get in trouble. But if you overclassify, it's hard to see how you get in trouble. So we have this problem. Senator Rand Paul has been pointing to it many, many times during this recent time. But for all these people, Hillary, Mike Pence, President Joe Biden, that have had these documents, they probably weren't, how to defend the United States from incoming missiles from Russia. There were probably some exchange with another foreign leader or something that's hopelessly unimportant. President Trump, possibly, sort of thinking of himself as a certain kind of person, wanted to go, apparently, as all the accounts around him say, he wanted to go through all this stuff. It had scattered together personal things of his, mementos, whatever. He was going to, when he got around to it, pull out the stuff that was super secret and to return it. There have been rumors, but there's no evidence that I've seen that there were things about, the U.S. missile systems or U.S. counter missile systems or nuclear submarines or things like that were in there. And of course, if there were, that's very, very serious. And all three of us would say that was very, very horrible if he had that stuff. But we're over stressing all these things that are supposedly secret, and that's actually not healthy for a free society.
Nope, I agree with you. There's probably an overclassification problem, that this is a good opportunity to take a gander at on a global scale. Of course, Trump's problem is whether they should have been classified or not. Once you get a grand jury subpoena to turn over documents, your step should be lawyers. Go down there to the ballroom and go through those boxes, and anything with a classified marking, give that to the people and be done with it. But this guy doesn't play.
They're also saying potentially that there are things that didn't have classification marks that were also things he shouldn't have had.
There might be, but there's enough that were stamped
Yes.
To hang him without even getting to the other stuff. Again, just stupidity in handling a matter by Trump.
But it may be, that if Hillary Clinton tripped up over this, dealing with this mass of classified material that she had access to, and if Joe Biden tripped over the same thing because there's mass of classified material he had access to, and if Mike Pence tripped over it and Donald Trump tripped over it, I kind of am thinking to myself, yeah, so he probably looks like he was guilty of obstructing that inquiry about the documents and trying to keep them hidden and so forth. But the magnitude of the wrong doesn't impress me as being terribly high. So I'm persuaded in a way that he was probably guilty of breaking that statute when he tried to obstruct by cutting the tape. But how highly significant is it in the light of this whole classified documents thing? But by contrast, in the other and more recent indictment, the one about a conspiracy to defraud and corruptly obstructing and so forth, this one I find much more concerning and much more dubious about the validity of the indictment, because it really seems to hinge on what former President Trump intended and what he believed at the time he was doing the things he was doing. Did he believe John Eastman, or did he believe John Eastman to be mistaken but used his ideas anyway, thus corruptly? Or did he really believe John Eastman was accurate and then he wasn't corrupt? How can the criminal law delve into the thoughts and intents of the heart, of the unspoken distinction between belief and illusion? Should the criminal law be used to delve that deeply with such fantastically huge potential consequences? I'm worried about the criminal law being deployed. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but I don't want the criminal law to be deployed to discern the intents of the hidden thoughts of the heart. What's that about?
And what about Al Gore and George W. Bush contesting? Or what about Stacey Abrams contesting? Or what about Hillary Clinton saying that President Trump was illegitimate? I mean, we have a problem here with free speech as well as people filing, objections about possible election fraud or miscounting or whatever. So this is a troubling thing. I think we also have to look at not just President Trump being in trouble, but Hunter Biden and Joe Biden being in trouble. We have both the plea deal issue and we have the statutes under which Hunter Biden is charged, and there are interesting aspects to both.
Well, let's try and understand that a little bit too. I'm not sure that I am sufficiently well-versed in the details, but there's the Foreign Agent Registration Act that Hunter Biden apparently should have registered, but he didn't. And then, of course, there's the question of whether, in relation to Burisma, the Ukrainian oil consortium company, whether he deployed his father's influence to get money, and whether Joe Biden, by sitting in on 20 business calls, apparently, according to this latest testimony, whether former Vice President, current President Joe Biden knew that he was sitting in on 20 business calls so that his son could get money off of the sound of Joe Biden's voice and influence. This is pretty concerning.
And related is the firing of the chief prosecutor in Ukraine who was looking into Burisma. Now,
is that the one that President Biden...
Ukraine was part of Vice President Biden's portfolio under President Obama. So that's a related matter. This is one of the impeachment charges that was voted by the House against President Trump had to do with his phone call to President Zelensky of Ukraine pertaining to this Burisma case also. So, I don't know. I think Bill Watkins needs to help us unpack
Wow.
all these
How
things.
could our
So
politics
the plea deal,
Yeah.
this Burisma thing, and it hasn't been charged, but and the debate over the plea deal in front of the judge, the issue of the Foreign Agents Registration Act came up. And then we have also the gun charge where he was a drug user, but non-violent, and yet he had a gun when possibly he shouldn't have had a gun and filled out a form improperly. But there's recent court decisions where you shouldn't deny the Second Amendment rights of citizens if they have done something that's not violent, and that's what blocks them from having a legitimate gun.
First of all,
That's a lot of things
he
to
did
weigh
get
in
a
on,
pretty
Bill
good deal.
Watkins. Do you have something
he ended
to
up
add?
with misdemeanor tax charges, though he could have been charged with felonies for the failure to report the income. And then on his gun issue, which he, of course, in his book and publicly has admitted he was a drug addict at the time. When he filled out form to purchase the firearm, obtained the firearm, he indicated he didn't have a substance abuse issue, and then told that was a false statement. But part of his deal was that rather than being indicted under it's the statutes 18 U.S.C. section 922G, it has various subsections. Rather than being indicted for that, he would do a drug counseling program, and all things would be forgiven there. So that was a pretty good result.
And peculiarly, and certainly the judge thought it was peculiar, instead of a prosecutor deciding that his diversion program hadn't worked out and that he was once again doing illegal things, the judge would have to decide this, not a prosecutor. What she was worried about.
Yeah, typically, any sort of diversion program, probation officer would supervise him. He would have to report to his probation officer, showing that he's completed whatever community service or rehab or classes, what have you. And then typically the probation officer submits to the prosecutor a memorandum at the end of it, assuming, let's say, he's done the right thing, attended all his classes, participated, graduated, a recommendation that that his period of supervision be ended, and sure, prosecutor files a motion with the court to that extent, but it's typically the probation office and the prosecutor's office that make those decisions, do the monitoring, make the recommendation there. But I will say, in Hunter Biden's defense, that's essentially being a drug user in possession, or I've tried myself a lot of cases under 922G, almost all of them felon in possession type cases, and I had to go look at the statutes. Addicts can't buy gun. I mean, it's right there, but it's something that I have never seen charged. And does it fit in this case? Sure, it fits, but in his defense, that is not a frequently wielded sword out there. But yeah, overall, he got a really good deal. And of course, this doesn't even really account for any of the corruption that Evers was talking about, where, only an idiot would think that he was hired over in Ukraine for his business ability and knowledge of the oil industry, and it didn't have anything to do with dear old dad and political influence. So he's not being punished for that. So, I mean, overall, yeah, he got a good deal. We'll see what happens. I'm sure the prosecutors and the defense lawyers are going to go back to the drawing board, try to come up with some arrangement that the judge will accept. But the contrast between Trump and out of the gate, hitting with the heaviest hammer you can, and Hunter Biden out of the gate, looking at mitigating circumstances, no real criminal history, it's not a crime of violence, let's cut him some slack here. Two very different perspectives and two very different outcomes sought.
Yeah, these comparisons are what make it a little bit uncomfortable, doesn't it? Go ahead, Bill Evers.
I wondered if you had thoughts on the line of cases that I'm not saying they. I mean, Hunter thing is pretty far along, but there are judges who are saying that if you're denying a firearm to somebody and it's for some kind of process crime or something that's not a violent thing,
yeah, I mean, this is all comes from Bruin,
right?
The Supreme Court decision in Bruin dealing with a New York registration licensing statute where you had to show a need to be able to carry a pistol, to have a weapon outside the home, like you were, say, had received threats or something. Court said, nope, that is outside the Second Amendment at the time of the framing or the time of the framing of the 14th Amendment. It's unclear which time period one would use there. There was no such restriction that anybody in any state had to show a need to carry a firearm. You could. So what Bruin means is that in all these cases, whether it be federal or state, where there's licensing requirements or prohibitions, like, say, felon in possession or drug addict in possession, we have to do a historical analysis and look to the framing period or the time of the 14th Amendment. And is this type of law, would that have been accepted then, approved in the normal course? Or are we deviating from this historical understanding? And if it's a deviation, it will be struck down. So that's sort of the lay of the land right now. It's a lot of things are up in the air at the present moment on gun crimes, and no doubt some of that analysis went into perhaps giving Hunter a little bit of a break on his 922G charge, when who knows what a court, if they did the historical research, if they could find any analogies to a drunk not being able to have a gun, or a madman versus a drug addict in this case under the federal statute. So interesting times with gun laws now.
Can we skip back to, we're talking about Hunter, let's skip back to his father for a minute here. I am struck by how can it be that in two successive presidencies, our highest level politics are all wound up with this Ukrainian thing. So, Vice President Biden apparently had leaned on the Ukrainians to fire a prosecutor, and then they did, and he boasted later that he had, successfully done that. But of course, at the same time, he was helping his son to get money from a company whose interests were at stake there. And so that was done. That seems problematic. And then President Trump leans on President Zelensky of Ukraine on some similar matters, threatens to withhold aid, doesn't follow through, doesn't withhold the aid. That was an impeachable offense. Was what President Biden did back when he was vice president an impeachable offense? I would respond to my own question initially with just this, and then I want to know what you guys think. But my own response to that would be, maybe, maybe not. It certainly doesn't look like a criminal offense because while on the one hand, Vice President Biden couldn't not have known that he was aiding Hunter's business by being in on those 20 business phone calls where Hunter was selling his brand to get money. He couldn't not know he was helping Hunter, but at the same time, he didn't actually promise anything, and arguably he had other reasons for the actions he took other than helping Hunter. So you'd have to really delve, kind of deep to analyze Joe Biden's motivation there. I'm not sure that was either impeachable or criminal. But I'm same thing. I'm not sure that the Trump thing was impeachable or criminal with regard to
I think there's definitely a double standard, and I think we're wading into a very dangerous area. There's never been criminal indictments of a former president, as we're seeing here. We were able to decide, let the mud fly and let the people make a choice. And that's how we have previously decided matters. So what is this going to be now? Is it going to be a tit for tat, that if a Republican were to win office and have a majority in the House and Senate, are we going to have retributions? Are we going to have kangaroo courts set up to even the score here? I mean, that's the way it's done in the third world, and unfortunately, it appears we're devolving into that. And we can thank the Democratic Party for being front and center and pushing us to a banana republic here. They're the ones that brought the 2 impeachments with these matters. And I do think impeachment is ultimately a political process anyway, but that's beside the point. That was not a good use of time or resources for the piddly, the Steele dossier and these other things that were at issue. But the main thing is that as a republic, is this where we're headed now? Despite what they want to make of January 6th, there was as is always has been, a peaceful transition of power. Sure, did Trump show up to shake Joe Biden's hand and hand over the reins? No, but neither did John Adams when Thomas Jefferson won the election in 1800. He skedaddled out of town and let his predecessor come in. So you don't have to necessarily be a gentleman, but we don't need this system of political retribution, which is what we're heading for here. And it looks like it's just going to get worse to me. It's unfortunate. And again, I hang it on the Democratic Party and their obsession with their favorite Hillary Clinton, who was a shoo-in when she did not win the presidency. As Evers indicated, she said Trump was illegitimate. Exactly. Election denier.
She was an election denialist. So, okay, enough said, I think. Well, let's take the last few minutes here to talk about something else a little different, but again, legal implications. So what's this news that, in fact, President Joe Biden's White House leaned even heavier on Facebook than we knew to get them to censor posts? I think that, Facebook can block whatever it wants, but if it's true that the President of the United States is weighing in to coerce a private company to block other people's free speech, that sounds like a violation of the First Amendment by the executive branch of the U.S. government.
Insert yourself into a private company like that happens to be almost in the position of a common carrier when it comes to information, and try to see that certain information is excluded and others more easily accessible. They had no business doing that. I think, again, if we wanted to play tit for tat, that's certainly an impeachable offense right there. If we wanted to go down that road, which I don't, I would No, but I would just say, again,
No, I don't want to go down that
let
road
the
either.
light shine on it
saying.
and let the people make a decision. Is this the type of executive you want running the country, where he and his minions lean on Facebook heavily, even more so than we thought, to have the right message out there?
Everest, have I missed a detail? What exactly did they try and get them to do, and how did they try and get him to do it?
Well, one of the things that they directly asked Facebook to change its algorithm to elevate what the Biden administration thought were authoritative sources that were promoting the messages on COVID-19 and treatments and public health policies and so forth that the administration endorsed, some of which turned out, of course, to be scientifically wrong. But just as they had with Twitter, now it has been revealed they were doing this with Facebook.
What if Facebook says, well, we would have done that anyways because we didn't like that bad information?
That's fine
be a
as far as I'm
defense?
concerned. Well, the question is not what Facebook's rights were. The question is Facebook and private individuals have free speech rights. Government does not have a right to dictate what speech there is and to control speech. And they increasingly, and certainly in this administration, think they have such a right.
Okay, so I'll be snarky and change the subject by saying, okay, I get that, but then what right does Ron DeSantis have to say how they should teach about slavery in the Florida school curriculum? Isn't he violating free speech?
Well, so Vice President Harris, Kamala Harris, denounced the Florida's academic content standards for American history that pertain to slavery. And she said, well, this sounds like they're saying that slavery is a beneficial institution. And this is a gross distortion of the facts. Had a panel headed by William Allen, a distinguished African-American scholar from Michigan State.
Very astute man and a friend of mine.
They went over all of this, and yes, it's true that African-American slaves learned things on plantations as slaves, like maybe blacksmithing or horseshoeing or learning to read or keep accounts for the plantation, that either sometimes they were contracted out to do things like this in the city, but still were slaves, but got to keep some portion of this. That was fairly unusual, but it happened in a few cases. If they became, they bought or somehow were freed by their master, they could then use these skills, or after emancipation, after slavery was outlawed and over, they were able to use these things. And this is part of the agency of these African Americans, in a sense, to say they were only victims. Nothing ever happened where they could, master skills and do things, is a denial of their humanity. So if anybody's racist, it's these people that are criticizing the fact that slaves were able to accomplish things in their lives, and also as ex-slaves. Primarily, we're talking about as ex-slaves, as former slaves.
Right, exactly. Well, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, let me restate my other question, which was if it's wrong for President Biden to try and shape what Facebook says.
Well, because we're dealing with Florida public schools,
to try and shape what the teachers say.
Facebook is not a organ of the government.
Yeah.
So it don't, right, for better or worse, they are. We're not arguing here whether
for better or worse,
private education, charter schools, homeschooling would be better than public schools. Probably yes to all of the above, but they are public schools. Therefore, the chief executive of the state and his secretary of education and so forth have a say in what is taught and what sort of standards. So it's apples and oranges.
They have an responsibility, actually, to say what the standards are. Am I right, Bill Evers?
Well, they could just stay silent on this, but the point is that courts have actually said in cases where the question has arisen, does the state have the right to set such curriculum? And the courts have found, yes, they do. These public schools are creatures of the state.
So, for example, and again, by comparison, since we're talking about Ron DeSantis in Florida, that people say, well, when he agreed or his administration agreed to have certain books not available to public school students at the taxpayer's expense, some people say, oh, well, that's censorship. But again, the books were actually still fully available to the public, and anybody could get them who wanted to. But his position was just that they weren't going to spend taxpayer money to provide these books, but then that was derided as censorship. It's the same kind of issue. People have trouble understanding the distinction between responsibility for state organizations
that's right.
and then coercion of
the
private
whole thing.
persons and
You're right.
companies.
He has a duty, and he's
I
especially
got that right.
with all the foolishness right now in education and the attempts, say, of the 1619 Commission and its curriculum to make the history of the United States really only about slavery, that be the key topic. Right-thinking people have a duty to push back against that and tell the full story of limited government, the rule of law, enterprising individuals, whether they be black or white, who were able to use skills and the market economy for many good things. That's part of the full story. And I'm glad to see someone's pushing back on the education establishment and others to get the full story out there.
So it's interesting bringing up the date 1619. The Florida Standards for American History say that children shall not learn about the history of slavery in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas before 1619. So the leftist agenda is that slavery, in a sense, descended from the sky in 1619, but the Florida standards go against this and support, of course, the actual history of slavery. And this is probably what triggered attacking him for the skills of African Americans passage, because the
left doesn't want people to know, since they're depending on victimization as the glue that holds the Democratic Party together, to understand that slavery was a human institution in all cultures, in all ages, in Africa, in Europe, in North America, and various Indian tribes, practice slavery. Not to say that it's a good institution, but it has been common among man, and that messes up their little theory that this is America's unique original sin that cannot be atoned for and cannot be forgiven. When people understand that this is a worldwide problem throughout the ages.
Listen, gentlemen, I am so grateful for all of your input, especially on the legal things we were discussing earlier. We did shed some light there. I hope it's helpful to our friends. As I think about the legal issues we were discussing, I'm reminded that...
Can I just insert something here?
Yes.
Despite the historical fact that Bill Watkins brings up about the ubiquitousness of slavery and going back to the earliest recorded information we have about human cultures. People who are classical liberals have always been in the forefront of calling for the immediate abolition of slavery. And we are supportive of them and fans of them. I don't want anything that we've said about the history of this horrible institution detract from the fact that classical liberalism is actually a political doctrine that is based on devotion to freedom and against slavery.
Yes, hear, hear. I totally agree with that. So again, with that said, I think we're going to call it quits for the day, but I do want to point out to our friends that we actually today are in the process of posting a number of interesting things that bear on the legal questions that we've been discussing. We are trying our best to make sure that the law has its proper place in a free society. We do want to live on the rule of law, but the rule of law doesn't cover everything bad in the world. And maybe that's a good thing because human freedom is also valuable. So we're grateful to live in a country which has at least a strong history of trying to uphold a well-defined rule of law that keeps people as free as possible. Let's hold on to it. Thank you again, Bill Evers, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good rest of your day, my friends.
And William Watkins Jr., thank you very much for your legal expertise. Yes, and both of you too. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Independent Outlook. Please visit independent.org anytime for more resources. Take care. Bye-bye.